Alora Voss is a 23-year-old woman who was falsely classified as an Omega after her mother, Alora Voss, the rightful Alpha heir of the Western Reaches, was executed and her territory stolen by the Graymoor Pack. Sold into the Omega registry at 14 and treated as property for 9 brutal years, Sarah endures starvation, abuse, and exploitation while her true heritage is deliberately hidden. During a Covenant summit where wolves are still bought and sold through an official registry, she finally snaps and burns the entire registry hall to the ground, determined to destroy the system that commodified countless lives. Trapped inside the burning building, she is rescued by Alpha King Kale Blackthorn, the most powerful wolf alive, who instantly recognizes her as his fated mate. Unlike the men who controlled her in the past, Kale refuses to claim ownership over her and instead offers her food safety, healing, and most importantly, a choice. As Sarah recovers, Kale reveals he has been secretly investigating corruption surrounding the registry system and the theft of her family's territory. Together, they expose decades of fraud, trafficking, and political manipulation that allowed Graymoor to steal the Western Reaches and reduce Sarah to registered property. The registry is abolished, thousands of wolves are freed from forced contracts, and Sarah's dormant wolf finally awakens, revealing her as a powerful Alpha heir rather than an Omega. When Alpha Graymoor arrives demanding her return as property, Sarah publicly confronts him, exposes his crimes, and watches him arrested. As her strength, confidence, and identity return, she gradually comes to trust Kale because he respects her autonomy and never pressures her into accepting the mate bond. Eventually, she chooses him freely, not because fate demands it, but because he treats her as an equal and gives her the freedom she has never known. They complete their bond. Graymoor is tried and stripped of power, the Western Reaches are restored to Sarah's bloodline, and a new era begins in which wolves can no longer be bought or sold. The story ends with Sarah becoming Luna of the Northern Territories while remaining her own person, finding love, justice, family, and the simple freedom to make her own choices after a lifetime of captivity. The smoke tasted like burning centuries, like charred leather and melted wax seals, and the acrid chemical bite of ink that had recorded the sale of wolf after wolf after wolf, and Sarah choked on all of it, her knees hitting the stone floor of the Covenant Hall as the flames crawled up the registry shelves behind her. She had not planned to die here. She had planned to burn every page, every name, every transaction that read like a cattle auction. Wolves listed by teeth condition and breeding potential. And a number always a number, because a number was easier to stomach than looking a 16-year-old Omega in the eyes and telling her she had been purchased. The fire had caught faster than she expected. The registry books were old, centuries of them, and the leather bindings were dry as bone. One match, that was all it took. One match, and a lifetime of fury that had been fermenting inside her chest since the day her own name appeared in those pages. Sarah Voss, age 14, category Omega. Breeding viability high, assigned to Graymoor Pack, price 400 silver. 400 silver, that was what her life had cost. She coughed, and the sound was wet, rattling. The smoke was turning black now, rolling across the ceiling like a living thing, and she could feel the heat pressing against her skin, tightening it, drying her eyes until she could barely see. She tried to crawl toward the door, but her hand slipped on the floor, which was slick with the rendered fat from the candles that had lined the registry shelves. Her palms burned. Her lungs burned, everything burned. Good, she thought, let it all burn. But her body disagreed with her mind, as bodies tend to do. Her throat spasmed. Her vision blurred at the edges, going gray, then dark, then gray again. She was 23 years old, and she weighed 112 pounds because the Graymoor Pack had fed their Omegas last always last. And sometimes there was nothing left but gristle and potato water. She was not strong enough to crawl through smoke. She collapsed. The stone was warm against her cheek, almost pleasant. She could hear the fire crackling and popping behind her, consuming the shelves, consuming the names, consuming the system that had stolen her from her mother and sold her like livestock. And even as her consciousness dimmed, she felt something she had not felt in 9 years. Satisfaction. Then the door exploded inward, not opened, not pushed, exploded, the iron hinges screaming as they tore from the stone, and through the wall of smoke a figure moved, a shape so large it seemed to fill the entire doorway. And Sarah thought with the disconnected calm of oxygen deprivation that death had come for her. And death was enormous. Hands found her. Not gentle hands, not careful hands, hands that grabbed and pulled and hauled her up against a chest that was as hard and unyielding as the stone floor she had been lying on. She was lifted like she weighed nothing, which given the state of her was close enough to true. An arm locked under her knees, another crushed her against a heartbeat that was hammering so hard she could feel it through her entire body. Then cold air, night air, air that tasted like pine sap and frost, and she sucked it in so desperately she gagged her body convulsing as it tried to remember how to breathe without smoke. She coughed and coughed and coughed until something dark and viscous came up and she spat it onto the ground and the arms holding her tightened instead of letting go. Which was strange because in her experience, people generally wanted to be far away from her when she was vomiting tar. When she could finally open her eyes, she saw gold, not metal, not jewelry eyes, golden eyes the color of late afternoon sun through amber resin, and they were staring down at her with an intensity that made the fire she had just escaped feel tepid by comparison. The face around those eyes was all hard angles and violence, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from granite, dark hair falling across a forehead marked by a scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline. He was not handsome the way paintings are handsome. He was handsome the way a storm is handsome, the way a cliff face is handsome, in a way that made you understand you were small and breakable and entirely at the mercy of something that did not care about your comfort. Except his hands were shaking. She could feel it, the faintest tremor running through those enormous hands where they gripped her, one under her knees and one pressed flat against her back. And the tremor was wrong. Men like this did not tremble. Men who could rip iron doors from their hinges did not shake while holding a woman who weighed barely more than a child. His nostrils flared. She watched it happen, watched his pupils blow wide, the gold swallowed by black, watched his lips part and his chest expand as he inhaled deeply, the way a man inhales when he has found water in the desert. And she knew what was happening because she had heard the Omega girls whisper about it at night in the Graymoor barracks, their voices hushed and aching with want. The kind of want that comes from knowing a thing exists but believing it will never exist for you. Mate bond. No. No, that was not possible. She was Omega. She was registered property of Graymoor Pack. She was soot-covered and half-starved, and her hair had been shorn close to her skull 6 weeks ago as punishment for refusing to pour wine at a dinner where the Pack Alpha had sold 3 girls to a northern territory. She looked like a boy. She smelled like 4 and vomit. She was no one's mate. But his hands were still shaking, and his wolf, she realized, was right at the surface. She could see it in the way the veins in his neck stood out like cords, in the way his jaw worked, in the way those golden eyes flickered, not changing color but intensifying, becoming less human and more animal with each breath. His wolf was pushing forward and the man was fighting it, and the battle was happening right in front of her, on his face, in his body, in the tremor of his hands. She knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. Kale Blackthorn, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, the Wolf Without Mercy, the Conqueror of Ashen Moor, and the Decimator of the Southern Rebellion, and a dozen other titles that all essentially meant the same thing, which was that he was the most powerful wolf alive, and that crossing him was not a mistake anyone made twice because there was rarely enough of them left to make it once. He had come for the Covenant Summit. All the Alpha leaders had. It was held here every 7 years in the ancient Covenant Hall where the registry was kept, where the packs renewed their agreements and traded their Omegas and settled their territorial disputes. The hall she had just set on fire. His voice when he finally spoke was not what she expected. It was low, rough, like gravel dragged across velvet, and it cracked on the second word. Who, he said. Who did this to you? She blinked. She was still coughing intermittently, her lungs spasming, and she realized he was not asking who set the fire. He was looking at her at the scar that ran along her collarbone where the Graymoor beta had pressed a heated brand, at the concavity of her cheeks, at the way her wrists were so thin the bones looked like they might puncture through the skin. He was looking at 9 years of Graymoor's hospitality written on her body, and his wolf was reading every word. She could feel something stirring in her own chest, something that had been dormant so long she had forgotten it existed. Her wolf, or what was left of her wolf, the small, quiet thing that had retreated so deep inside her on the day she was sold that she had stopped feeling it entirely. It was stirring now. Not waking, not yet, but shifting in its sleep like something had disturbed its hibernation. His scent reached her then, through the smoke still clinging to her clothes, through the char and the ash, through all of it. She caught it. Cedar. Not the clean cedar of a closet shelf, but the deep wild cedar of a forest that had never been logged, ancient and dense and alive. Under that, something warmer, wood smoke. But not the acrid smoke of burning records, the wood smoke of a hearth of a fire contained and purposeful and safe. Safe. The word hit her like a physical thing, and she flinched. Actually flinched because safety was not something she recognized. Safety was a foreign country. Safety was a language she had spoken as a child and forgotten as an adult. And smelling it on this man, this terrifying, enormous, powerful man, made her eyes sting in a way that had nothing to do with smoke. "Put me down," she said. Her voice was a wreck shredded, but she said it clearly enough. And she meant it. Because whatever the mate bond was doing, whatever her dormant wolf was whimpering about, she knew one fundamental truth. Power did not protect, power consumed. She had been owned by a powerful man for 9 years, and she had the scars to prove it. He did not put her down. Instead, his arm tightened under her knees, and he pulled her closer, tucking her head beneath his chin. And she could feel the vibration in his chest. He was growling, not at her, at the world, at whatever had carved those scars into her, at the fact that she existed in this condition, at the gap between what she was and what she should have been. I said, "Put me down." No. One word, no negotiation, no explanation, just no. She tried to push against his chest, but her arms were weak and her hands were burned, and the effort lasted approximately 2 seconds before she gave up. Not because she accepted it, but because her body simply did not have the resources to fight a man who could bench press a horse. Around them, chaos was unfolding. She could hear it even with her face pressed against his chest. Shouts, running feet, the crack and groan of the Covenant Hall's roof beginning to buckle. Wolves were pouring out of the surrounding buildings, drawn by the smoke and the fire and the scent of destruction. She could hear voices overlapping. The registry is burning. Someone has burned the mating registry. Good, she thought again. And this time, despite everything, despite the smoke damage in her lungs and the burns on her palms and the fact that she was being held like a captive by the most dangerous wolf on the continent, she smiled. He felt it, the shift of her mouth against his collarbone. He pulled back just enough to look at her, and those golden eyes narrowed. And something passed across his face that was not anger and not confusion, but something adjacent to both. "You did this," he said. It was not a question. She met his eyes. "Yes." The corner of his mouth twitched, not a smile. Not quite, but something in the geography of his expression rearranged itself, and for 1/2 second the wolf without mercy looked almost impossibly impressed. Then a new voice cut through the noise, sharp and imperious, and the moment evaporated. "That is Graymoor property." The voice belonged to a man approaching from the eastern lodge, flanked by 4 enforcers. Thick-necked, red-faced, his left hand adorned with rings that caught the firelight. Beta Harlan of Graymoor Pack, the man who managed the Omega barracks, the man who had branded Sarah's collarbone with a heated iron because she had looked him in the eye. He stopped 10 feet from the Alpha King, and his nostrils flared, reading the situation, reading the position of the girl in those arms. And something shifted in his expression. Not fear calculation. "Your Majesty," Harlan said, adjusting his tone to something approaching deference. "The Omega in your arms belongs to Graymoor Pack. She is registered stock. I can show you the documentation once the fire is," he paused, contained. Stock, the word hung in the air like smoke. Caleb Blackthorn's growl changed pitch. It dropped. It became something that was felt more than heard. A subsonic vibration that made the ground hum, and the enforcers behind Harlan take an involuntary step backward. Sarah felt it travel through her bones. "Say that word again," Caleb said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant, which was worse. Harlan's eyes flickered between the Alpha King and the Omega in his arms. He was recalculating. She could see it happening, the gears turning behind his eyes, the political math being done. An Alpha King, a burnt registry, an Omega who should have been crawling at his feet, not cradled against the most powerful chest in the known territories. "Your Majesty," Harlan tried again, his voice oilier now. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside. The girl she is troubled, defective. She has been violent before. She attacked a dinner guest, refused direct orders. She burned down the 'she is my mate.' 3 words spoken at a volume that should have been quiet but somehow carried like cannon fire across the entire courtyard. And every wolf within earshot went absolutely utterly still. Sarah went still too. Not because she was surprised. She had known from the moment his scent reached her, from the moment her dormant wolf stirred. But hearing it spoken aloud, claimed publicly by the Alpha King in front of the man who had owned her for 9 years was something different. It was a detonation. Harlan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked like a fish that had been pulled from water and was only now beginning to understand the implications of air. That is, he started that cannot. She is Omega. She has no wolf. The bond does not activate with. Kale stepped forward. 1 step, that was all. 1 step, still carrying Sarah as though she were made of glass. And Harlan stumbled backward, his enforcers scattering like pigeons. I found her choking on smoke in a building she set on fire to stop your trade in living beings, Kale said. And your first thought was to call her property. He tilted his head, and the gesture was pure wolf, all predator, all calculation. Tell me, Beta Harlan, what do you think happens next? It was not a question, it was a death sentence with a question mark. Sarah should have been afraid. She was being held by a man who was clearly capable of violence on a scale she could barely comprehend. A man whose wolf was so close to the surface she could see the shift rippling under his skin. She should have been terrified. Instead, she was looking at Harlan's face and memorizing every shade of fear that passed across it. 9 years. 9 years of that man's voice telling her to kneel, to serve, to submit, to accept that she was less than nothing. 9 years of scrubbing floors on hands and knees while he stepped over her like furniture. 9 years of potato water and thin blankets and the brand on her collarbone and the sound of other girls crying in the dark. She reached up and touched Caius's jaw. It was impulsive. Stupid, probably. Her burned fingers against the hard line of his jaw, and she felt him freeze. Every muscle in that enormous body going rigid, and then slowly, deliberately, he turned his head and pressed his mouth against her burned palm. Not a kiss, something more careful than that. His lips barely brushed the raw skin, and his breath was warm, and his eyes closed, and the growl in his chest softened to something that was almost a purr. The wolves watching from the courtyard said nothing. They had never seen the Alpha King close his eyes for anyone. I want to stand, Sarah said. He opened his eyes, searched her face, then slowly he set her down. His hands did not leave her. One stayed on her waist, the other on her shoulder, steadying her. And she hated that she needed the steadying because her knees were made of water and her lungs were still full of smoke. But she stood. She stood in the courtyard of the Covenant Summit in front of 40 wolves from 12 packs wearing a threadbare gray shift that ended above her knees, covered in soot, barefoot on cold stone with burns on her palms and a brand scar on her collarbone and the shaved head of a punished Omega. And she stood. Harlan said. Her voice was gravel and ash. I burned every page, every record, every name, every price. You will never sell another girl. Harlan's face went through several colors, white, red, a mottled purple. He opened his mouth to speak, and what came out surprised everyone, including, it seemed, himself. Your mother, he said. And his voice was strange, smaller than she had ever heard it. Your mother was the same. She stood exactly like that when they came for her. He stopped, swallowed. Something passed across his face, quick and involuntary, a ghost of something that looked almost like grief or the memory of grief, and then it was gone, replaced by the familiar hardness, but Sarah had seen it, and it rattled her more than anything else that had happened that night, before the what she said. But Harlan had reassembled himself. His jaw set, his eyes went flat. She is Graymoor's legal. Kale's hand lifted from Sarah's shoulder. One movement, that was all. One casual lift of his hand, and the air in the courtyard changed, became something thick and electric, and Harlan choked on his own words because the Alpha King's dominance hit him like a wall. Not a display, not a posture, an actual physical force that drove Harlan to his knees on the stone, his hands bracing against the ground, his neck bending involuntarily to expose his throat. The enforcers behind him went down too, like puppets with cut strings. You mention ownership one more time, Kale said, and his voice was still conversational, still almost pleasant, and the juxtaposition between his tone and the force pouring off him was nauseating. And I will remove your tongue. Then I will remove your title. Then I will remove your pack's territory, and then, Beta Harlan, I will remove you. Silence. The fire crackled behind them. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, long and mournful, as if mourning the old world that was burning in that hall. Sarah swayed. The adrenaline was wearing off, and her body was remembering that it was damaged, smoke, poisoned, malnourished, running on fury, and not much else. She felt Kale's hand return to her waist, steadying, and she wanted to push it away and lean into it in equal measure, and the contradiction was so exhausting she nearly laughed. Come with me, he said, quiet for her ears only. Where somewhere with food and a healer. She looked up at him, the firelight carved shadows across his face deepening the scar at his temple, catching the gold in his eyes. He was terrifying. He was the most powerful wolf alive. He was asking her to come with him, and there was no command in it despite everything, despite what he was, despite the dominance still radiating off him in waves that made the other wolves in the courtyard press themselves lower. He was asking. She had not been asked anything in 9 years. Okay, she said. Then her knees buckled, and he caught her before she hit the ground, and this time she did not tell him to put her down. The healer's name was Maron. She was old, 60 at least, with hands spotted by age and eyes sharp as surgical instruments. She worked in the Alpha King's mobile quarters, a suite of rooms in the northern wing of the Summit Lodge, and she did not speak while she examined Sarah. She simply cleaned the burns on Sarah's palms with a salve that smelled like eucalyptus and something sharper antiseptic, listened to Sarah's lungs with a stethoscope that was cold against her chest, pressed her fingers into the hollows beneath Sarah's ribs, feeling the topography of malnutrition. Kale stood in the doorway. He had not left. Sarah could feel his presence the way you feel the sun through a window, a warmth that was constant and impossible to ignore. He watched Maron work with an expression that was carefully blank, but his hands resting at his sides kept curling into fists and releasing. When Marin finally spoke, it was to him, not to her. The smoke damage will heal in a few days. The burns are 2nd degree. They will scar, but she will have full use of her hands. She paused. The rest will take longer. Define the rest, he said. Marin met his eyes. She is approximately 30 pounds underweight. Her bone density is that of a woman twice her age. The brand on her collarbone was done with a crude instrument and infected at least once without treatment. There are older fractures in her left wrist and 2 ribs that healed without being set. She turned to Sarah with a look that was not pity, but something more useful. When did you last eat a full meal? Sarah had to think about it. The fact that she had to think about it was its own answer. She has a wolf, Kale said. The statement came from somewhere behind the blankness of his expression, somewhere raw. Marin raised an eyebrow, looked at Sarah, looked back at the Alpha King. She has the ghost of one dormant so long it is nearly extinguished. Survival mechanism. When the body is starved and the spirit is broken, the wolf retreats to protect what little energy remains. She paused. It is possible it will return with proper nutrition and safety. It is also possible it will not. The sound Kale made was not a word. It was a sound from the bottom of his chest, guttural and wounded, and Sarah flinched because she recognized it. It was the sound wolves made when their pack was dying, when something fundamental had been taken. Leave us, he said to Marin. Marin gathered her supplies without argument. At the door, she paused and looked at Sarah. The salve should be reapplied every 6 hours, and eat slowly. Your stomach will not tolerate a large meal. She left. The room was warm. A fire burned in the hearth, real logs cedar, and the irony was not lost on Sarah. The furnishings were sparse but solid. A bed with actual blankets, thick wool and furs. A table with a jug of water. A chair by the fire. The floor was covered with a rug that was woven in the pattern of the Northern Territories. Dark greens and blacks intersected by lines of gold. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her bandaged hands and waited for whatever came next, because in her experience, something always came next. And it was rarely good. Kyle crossed the room. He did not sit. He knelt in front of her. This man who was king, this wolf who made other wolves press their bellies to the ground, and he looked up at her from his knees. And his golden eyes were clear and steady, and absolutely terrifyingly sincere. I need you to tell me, he said, everything they did. She shook her head. You already know what they did. The healer just cataloged it. I need to hear it from you. He paused. So I know exactly how much to destroy. She laughed. It came out ragged and bitter, and it hurt her damaged lungs, but she could not stop it. You cannot just destroy things because of a bond you did not ask for, she said. You do not even know me. You do not know my name. I am a stranger who burned down a building and you pulled me out of the smoke. And now your wolf is telling you I am yours, but I am not. I have never been anyone's. I was sold at 14 and I have spent every day since then being someone else's property. And I will not be that again. Not even for you, not even if you are a king. Not even if the bond, Sarah, he said. She stopped. Your name is Alora Voss. You were born in the Western Reaches to Alora Voss, who was executed by the Graymoor Alpha Council when you were 5. You were placed in the Omega registry at 14. You have been in the Graymoor barracks for 9 years. You have been written up for insubordination 12 times, which is a record. You poured boiling water on a visiting dignitary who attempted to enter the Omega sleeping quarters after dark. He paused. I know your name. I have known it for 3 hours. 3 hours. Since the summit convened, I reviewed the registry as part of the summit protocols. Alpha Kings are given access to the full records. He paused again, and something in his expression shifted. I was reviewing the records when I smelled the smoke. You were reading the registry, she said slowly. I was looking for someone. A specific entry. Who you? The word landed in the space between them and sat there heavy with implication. Sarah stared at him. His eyes did not waver. "Your mother, Alora Voss," he said. She was not an Omega, she was an Alpha heir of the Western Reaches, the full-blooded line. When her pack was absorbed by Graymoor, her status was falsified. Her daughter was classified as Omega to prevent any future claim to the territory. Sarah's mouth opened closed. Her burned hands clenched in the bandages, and the pain was sharp and grounding. "I do not have a wolf," she said. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "You have a wolf that was starved into dormancy," he said, "by people who knew exactly what they were doing." The room was very quiet, the fire popped. A log shifted, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. Sarah could hear her own breathing, still raspy, still labored, and under that the sound of her heart, which was beating in a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, faster, and more urgent, as though it had somewhere to be. "How do you know this?" she whispered. "Because I have been investigating the Western Reaches annexation for 2 years. Because 11 packs have filed complaints about Omega trafficking through the registry system. Because I came to this summit to shut it down." He looked at her, and his mouth curved just slightly. "You just got there first." She stared at him, then she started laughing again, and this time it was real full, and it tore through her damaged throat like glass. And she did not care. "I burned it," she said. "I burned the whole thing. You burned the whole thing," he agreed. "Good." "Yes." The corner of his mouth again, that almost smile. "Good." She stopped laughing because her lungs could not sustain it, and the coughing returned, and he reached for the water jug without being asked and poured a cup and held it to her lips. She drank. The water was cool and clean, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. When she lowered the cup, his thumb brushed a streak of soot from her cheek. The touch was light, barely there. And her dormant wolf, that small quiet thing buried in her chest, stirred again. Not waking, but lifting its head. "I am not going to claim you," he said. She blinked. "I am not going to mark you. I am not going to announce you as my Luna. I am not going to drag you before a pack and declare ownership because you have had enough of being owned." Something in her chest cracked. Not broke, cracked the way ice cracks in spring, a fracture that lets light through. "What I am going to do," he said, "is feed you and heal your hands, and when you are strong enough, I am going to give you a choice. A real one, the first one you have had in 9 years. What choice? Whether you want me." The simplicity of it undid her. Not the grand gesture, not the kneeling, not the display of power in the courtyard. This, the absence of demand, the presence of patience. The radical, terrifying, completely unprecedented act of giving an Omega a choice. She put her bandaged hand on top of his, and he turned his hand over and held hers gently, so gently it made her throat ache. And they sat like that in the firelight, while the Covenant Hall burned to the ground outside. In the morning, the ashes of the registry were cold. Sarah stood in the ruins with Kale beside her, and surveyed her work with the detached satisfaction of someone examining a successful demolition. Charred shelves, melted wax seals pooled on the floor like black blood. The stone walls were intact because stone does not burn, but everything inside was gone. Every book, every record, every name. 40 Alpha delegates milled around the perimeter, their expressions ranging from outrage to confusion, to, in a few cases, barely concealed relief. The registry had made some of them very rich. It had also made some of them sick. Alpha Theron of the Coastal Pack caught Sarah's eye from across the ruins. He was younger than most of the delegates, lean and sandy-haired, and he gave her a nod so slight it could have been a muscle twitch. But she saw it, and she understood it. The political fallout was immediate and massive. Beta Harlan had retreated to the Graymoor quarters with his enforcers and was making furious calls to his Alpha. 3 packs demanded that the arsonist be punished under Covenant law. 2 packs quietly destroyed their own copies of the registry before anyone could subpoena them. Kale called a summit assembly for midday. Sarah was not invited. She was told to rest to eat to let her lungs heal. She was given a room adjacent to Kale's quarters with a lock on the inside, which he pointed out specifically emphasizing the inside part, and left her with a tray of food. She ate slowly as Marin had instructed: broth first, then bread, real bread, not the gummy gray stuff from the Graymoor barracks, but actual bread with a crust that crackled when she tore it. Butter, an apple. She ate the apple core and all seeds and stem because 9 years of hunger does not disappear with one meal, and her body did not believe there would be more. There was a mirror in the room. She avoided it for an hour. Then curiosity won, as it always does. She looked. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. Shorn head, the stubble just beginning to grow back dark as ink. Hollowed cheeks, eyes that were too large for her face, not because her eyes were remarkable, but because her face had lost so much weight that everything else had shrunk around them. The scar on her collarbone, a ridged crescent Graymoor's brand. Arms corded with lean muscle from years of scrubbing and hauling and surviving, not the soft arms of a kept woman, but the arms of someone who worked. She was not pretty, she knew this. Pretty was a luxury that required calories and sleep and the absence of fear, and she had not had any of those things in sufficient quantities. But her eyes were strange. They had always been dark brown, unremarkable, but in the mirror's light she caught something beneath the brown-like light beneath water, a flicker of gold. She blinked, it was gone. She ate the rest of the bread and stared at the locked door and thought about choices. The summit assembly, she learned later, was a bloodbath. Not literally, though several wolves got close. Kyle stood before the 40 delegates in the Great Hall and announced in the same conversational tone he had used when threatening to remove Harlan's tongue that the mating registry system was permanently abolished. That any pack found engaging in the sale trade or involuntary transfer of wolves would lose its territorial charter, that a formal investigation into the Western Reaches annexation would begin immediately, that any Omega currently held under registry contracts was free to leave or free to stay, but free. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that precedes either war or transformation, and it was not immediately clear which. Alpha Graymoor was not present, but his beta was. Harlan stood, his face was composed, his rings glinting under the hall's iron chandeliers, and he spoke in a voice that was steady and reasonable and calibrated to appeal to the wolves in the room who stood to lose profit. With respect, Your Majesty, the registry has maintained interpack stability for 3 centuries, abolishing it based on the actions of a single deranged Omega who committed arson. She is not an Omega, Kale said. She is an Alpha heir whose status was falsified to facilitate the theft of her territory. The room stirred. Murmurs ran through the delegates like wind through tall grass. Harlan's composure cracked just slightly, just enough for Sarah to see it on the face of the wolf who relayed the story to her that evening. That is Harlan started. Documented, Kale said. He held up a sheaf of papers. Not all records were kept in the registry hall, Beta Harlan. Some were kept in the Royal Archives, some were kept in the private files of the Western Reaches Council before it was dissolved. And some were kept by your own Alpha, who it turns out was quite meticulous about recording exactly how he stole the territory. He fanned the papers out on the table. Bloodline verification, territory transfer documents with forged signatures, minutes from a private council meeting in which the execution of Alora Voss was discussed and approved. Harlan stared at the papers, and something happened that none of the delegates expected. He sat down, not in defeat, not in surrender. He sat down and put his hands flat on the table and looked at the papers. And then he looked at Kyle and said in a voice that was quiet and stripped of all its political veneer, "She was my cousin." The room went silent again. Alora Harlan said, "She was my cousin. We grew up in the same house before Graymoor absorbed the Western Reaches, before any of this." He paused. "She used to steal honey cakes from the kitchen and blame it on me." No one spoke. He blinked twice rapidly, and then his face closed again like a door slamming shut. And when he spoke next, his voice had regained its smooth professional cadence. Regardless of historical grievances, the registry system serves a vital your cousin was executed, her daughter was sold, and you administered the barracks where that daughter was kept for 9 years. He leaned forward. Did you know the entire time Harlan's jaw worked? His fingers flat on the table twitched. "I followed orders," he said. That Kyle said is not an answer. But it was Sarah thought when she heard it. It was the most honest answer Harlan had ever given. Not a justification, not a defense, an admission that he had known and chosen compliance and lived with it, and turned the guilt into authority because that was easier than turning it into action. She thought of the moment in the courtyard. Your mother was the same. She stood exactly like that, the ghost of something on his face he had known. He had always known. And the knowing had rotted him from the inside out, and she could not decide if that made him less of a monster or more of one. The assembly voted, 31 to 9, the registry was abolished. The 9 dissenting packs were noted loudly, and Kale made it clear that noted was a prelude to investigated. By evening, the first Omegas began to leave. Sarah watched from the window of her room as they walked out of the summit grounds in 2s and 3s, carrying nothing because they had nothing to carry. And the sight of them walking freely without escort, without chains, without registry numbers branded into their skin or tattooed on their wrists made her forehead against the cold glass and close her eyes and breathe. 3 days passed. Sarah ate, she slept. She let Marin change her bandages and listened to Marin's dry commentary about the political chaos unfolding at the summit. She walked the ground, slowly building stamina, and wolves she did not know stepped aside when she passed. Not because she was the Alpha King's mate, but because word had spread about what she had done. And there was a new kind of regard in their eyes, the girl who burned the registry, the girl who burned the system. Kale visited every evening. He did not stay long. He brought food always, as if the act of providing sustenance was a language he spoke more fluently than words. Roasted chicken with rosemary fresh bred apples from the summit orchards. He sat in the chair by the fire and told her about the day's proceedings, the political maneuvering, the threats, the alliances forming and dissolving, and she asked questions and he answered them, and the conversation stretched longer each night. He never touched her, not once, not after that first night when he had knelt and held her hand. He maintained a careful physical distance that was, she realized, gradually costing him something immense. She could see it in the way he gripped the arms of the chair, in the way his jaw tightened when she moved and her scent shifted, in the way his golden eyes tracked her across the room with a hunger that was not predatory but devotional. The look of a man standing outside a cathedral. On the third night, she asked him about his wolf. What does it feel like, she said. The bond from your side. He was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Shadows moved across the walls. It feels like every room I've ever entered was missing something and I did not know what it was until now, he said. It feels like my wolf has been looking for you in every face and every scent for 32 years. And now that he has found you, he has gone very still and very quiet and very certain the way a predator goes still when it has finally found its mate after a long hunt. Not to kill, to rest. She looked at him, he looked at the fire. But you will not touch me, she said. No. Why? 'Cause you flinch when someone moves too fast. Because you slept with your back against the wall. Because the first thing you did when I put you down was check the exits. He met her eyes. I will not add myself to the list of things you endure. The crack in her chest widened, the ice thinned, and deep in her core, so deep she almost did not feel it, her wolf lifted its head and opened one eye. On the 4th day, Alpha Graymoor arrived. He came with 40 wolves armed in 3 black vehicles that tore through the summit gates without stopping. He was a large man, not as large as Kyle, but thick, built like a bull with close-set eyes and a beard that was more gray than black. His wolf was a muddy brown, unremarkable, but his power was real. The power of a man who had ruled through fear for 30 years. He wanted his Omega back. He said this in the courtyard in front of witnesses with his 40 wolves arrayed behind him like a threat made flesh. He said it calmly, reasonably, the way a man discusses the return of stolen goods. The girl had been purchased legally under the covenant. The registry's destruction did not retroactively void existing contracts. The Alpha King's personal attachment to the property in question was frankly a conflict of interest. Property. Again. Sarah stood at the window of her room and watched and felt something strange happening in her chest. Not fear, not anger, something lower, deeper, something that had roots. She put her hand on her sternum and felt it. A pulse. Not her heart, something else. Something underneath. Her wolf opened its other eye. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced. It was heat, but not fever heat. Deep heat, the kind that comes from the gut of the earth, from magma, from the place where rock becomes liquid. It spread through her chest and down her arms and into her fingertips, and the bandages on her hands suddenly felt too tight, confining. She tore them off. The burns on her palms were gone. Not healed, gone. The skin was smooth, unmarked, as though fire had never touched it. She stared at her hands, turning them over, and watched as the scar on her left wrist, the healed fracture that had ached every winter for 7 years, smoothed itself out like wrinkled fabric being pressed flat. In the courtyard below, Alpha Graymoor was still talking, still making his case, still using the word property in the specific legal sense as if the specific legal sense made it less obscene. Kale had not responded. He stood opposite Graymoor with his arms crossed and his expression blank and his wolf very, very close to the surface. And Sarah could see from 3 stories up that his control was fraying. The veins in his forearms stood out, his eyes had gone fully gold. He was going to kill Graymoor. She could see it, he was going to snap, and his wolf was going to take over, and it would be war, actual war. Because Graymoor was allied with 6 other packs, and killing their alpha at a peace summit would shatter whatever fragile order remained. She left the room. She did not run. She walked down 3 flights of stairs through the lodge's main hall, past startled wolves who pressed against the walls as she passed. Not because of who she was, but because of what was rolling off her, power, raw, untrained, uncontrolled, like a dam breaking. She walked through the front doors and into the courtyard, and the sunlight hit her, and her wolf woke up, fully, completely. After 9 years of hibernation, 9 years of starvation, 9 years of silence, her wolf opened its eyes and stood and stretched and howled inside her chest. And the sound that came out of Sarah's mouth was not a scream and not a howl, but something in between. Something that made every wolf in the courtyard freeze, including Kale, including Graymoor. Her eyes were gold, not amber, not flickering gold, true gold, the deep, impossible gold of a full-blooded alpha. And the power that poured off her was not the dominance of a trained wolf, but the raw seismic force of a bloodline that had been suppressed for almost a decade and was done being quiet. Graymoor took a step back. His wolves behind him whined. Actually whined. High-pitched and involuntary, the sound subordinate wolves make when confronted with a superior they cannot challenge. Because Sarah was not an Omega, she had never been an Omega, she was the last daughter of the Western Reaches Alpha line, a bloodline so old and so powerful that the Graymoor Pack had spent 30 years trying to erase it from existence, and it had not worked. You could not erase what was written in the blood, you could starve it, you could brand it, you could lock it in a barracks and feed it potato water and shave its head and call it property, but you could not kill it, not fully, not permanently, it always came back. Sarah walked toward Graymoor. Her bare feet on the cold stone made no sound. The power rolling off her in waves made the torches along the courtyard wall flicker and lean. She was not large. She was still underweight, still angular, still marked by years of deprivation. But size had never been the measure of a wolf. "You killed my mother," she said. Her voice was not loud, it did not need to be. When you are the earthquake, you do not need to shout. Graymoor's jaw worked. His close-set eyes darted to his wolves, calculating backup, calculating odds, and finding them unfavorable. The Alpha King was behind him, an awakened Alpha heir was in front of him. He was standing in a courtyard full of witnesses who had just voted to abolish the system that had made him wealthy. "The girl is confused." He started. "My mother's name was Alora Voss. She was your predecessor's equal in rank and your superior in power, and you had her executed because she refused to give you her territory. You forged the transfer documents. You reclassified her daughter. You sold me for 400 silver. Each sentence landed like a stone. Each one was specific. Each one was documented because Kaylee had spent 2 years building this case, and now Seraph was delivering it in person in the courtyard with golden eyes and a voice that did not shake. Graymoor looked at Kaylee. The Alpha King had not moved, had not spoken. He stood with his arms at his sides and his golden eyes on Seraph, and an expression on his face that was not pride exactly, but something close to awe. "This is not the venue for," Graymoor began. "Every venue is the venue," Seraph said. "Every room, every courtyard, every hall where wolves gather and pretend that selling children is tradition." She took another step. "I did not burn the registry for revenge. I burned it because it was wrong. Because every name in those books was a person who deserved a choice and was never given one. Because the system was not broken, it was designed to make powerless things of powerful beings." She stopped 3 feet from Graymoor. She could smell him, stale sweat and expensive cologne, and underneath the sour tang of fear. She had never smelled his fear before. It was satisfying in a way that surprised her. Not because it felt good, but because it felt true. "You are going to answer for what you did," she said. "Not to me, to the council that the Alpha King convenes, to every wolf whose name was in that registry, to every family that was broken." She paused, and then because she was Alora Voss's daughter, and Alora Voss had stood exactly like this before they killed her, she said, "And you are going to answer honestly because my mother deserved honesty, and she never got it." Graymoor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Behind her, Kale spoke for the first time. "Seize him," he said quietly. 4 of Kale's personal guard moved forward. Graymoor's wolves did not resist. They could not. The combined dominance of an awakened Alpha heir and the Alpha King was pressing down on them like an ocean, and some things are simply too heavy to fight. Graymoor was taken, his wrists bound, his face a mask of disbelief. As the guards led him past Sarah, he stopped. "Your mother," he said, and his voice was different now, stripped of authority, stripped of calculation, the voice of a man who had run out of moves. "Your mother was the best of us. I knew it then. I know it now." Sarah looked at him. His close-set eyes, which she had feared for 9 years, were small and tired and old. Then why, she said. "Because she would have changed everything," he said. and I was not ready for everything to change. The guards took him away. The courtyard emptied slowly, wolves dispersing in clusters, murmuring, processing. The world was different now. The system that had governed their lives for 3 centuries was ash, literally. And the woman who had burned it was standing in the courtyard with golden eyes and bare feet and the power of an alpha line that should have been extinct. Kale walked toward her, slowly, not because he was cautious, but because he was savoring it. The sight of her standing in the open hole, powerful, free. His wolf was practically vibrating inside him, and she could feel it. The resonance between his wolf and hers, the two of them humming at the same frequency like tuning forks struck in unison. He stopped in front of her. Close. Close enough that she could smell the cedar and wood smoke of him. Close enough that the bond between them pulled taut like a wire. "You are terrifying," he said. She almost smiled. "Is that a compliment?" "It is a fact." She looked at his eyes, gold meeting gold, and she could see herself reflected in them, and the woman she saw was not the skeleton in the barracks, not the number in the registry, not the brand on the collarbone. The woman she saw was her mother's daughter. She reached up, put her hand on his jaw, the same gesture as the first night, but different now. Her hand healed her power, awake, her wolf pressing against her skin like it wanted to meet his. "You said you would give me a choice," she said. His throat moved. "I did. I have made it." She pulled him down to her, not to kiss him. She put her forehead against his, and their breath mingled, and his hands came up slowly, trembling, again, always trembling when it came to her, and cupped her face, and his thumbs traced the hollows of her cheeks, the angles that would soften with time and food and the absence of fear. And his wolf pressed against the surface of his skin, and her wolf pressed against hers, and the space between them was so small it barely existed. "I choose you," she said. "Not because of the bond, not because you are king, because you knelt, because you asked, because you gave me a door with a lock on the inside, and food without conditions and time without pressure." She pressed her forehead harder against his. "Because you saw what I was and did not try to save me from it, you just made sure I had room." His hands tightened on her face, his breathing was ragged. The Alpha King, the wolf without mercy, the conqueror of Ashen Moor, was shaking like a leaf. "Tell me," he said. His voice was wrecked. "Tell me what you want." "Mark me," she said. "Not because I'm yours, because I'm mine, and I choose to carry your mark." He made a sound low and broken and full. Then he pulled her close and his arms wrapped around her, and she felt for the first time in 9 years enclosed without being trapped. His mouth found the curve of her neck, not the branded collarbone, the other side, the unmarked side, and his breath was hot, and his lips were careful, and his teeth grazed her skin. And she tilted her head back and gave him a throat not in submission and trust. The bite was sharp, brief, a sting that deepened into warmth, and then into something that transcended warmth, a connection that went deeper than skin, deeper than bone, deeper than the physical body altogether. She felt his wolf meet hers, felt them circle each other in some interior landscape that had no name, felt them settle together the way 2 puzzle pieces settle when you find the match after years of searching. His wolf was enormous, black, scarred across the muzzle, and when it met hers, it did not dominate. It lay down beside her and pressed its flank against hers and closed its eyes. Her wolf, small but luminous golden in a way that defied biology, curled against its side and breathed. When he lifted his mouth from her neck, his eyes were wet. Not tears exactly, something more essential, as if the marking had opened something in him that had been closed for a very long time. She touched the mark on her neck. It was warm, permanent, hers. The Summit Council convened the following week to formalize the new accords. Sarah sat at the table, not behind it, not beside it, at it, in a chair equal in height to the Alpha Kings. She wore a shirt that left her collarbone visible, the brand scar exposed, because she had decided that scars were not things to hide, but things to read, a record of survival written in the grammar of the body. Alpha Graymoor was tried by the council. He confessed not fully, not to everything, but to enough. The territory of the Western Reaches was returned to its rightful heir. Sarah did not want it, not yet. She was 23 years old, and she had spent less than 2 weeks as a free woman, and she was not ready to rule anything except herself. But the territory was held in trust, and the Omegas who had served in Graymoor's barracks were given settlement rights within its borders. And the first thing they built was a kitchen. Not a barracks, not a registry office. A kitchen with a long table and enough chairs for everyone and a window that faced east toward the sunrise. Beta Harlan disappeared. Sarah heard months later that he had gone north to the borderlands, to a territory so remote that pack law barely reached it. She did not know if he went as exile or as penance or simply as a man who could not live in the world he had helped create. She thought of his face in the courtyard. Your mother was the same. She stood exactly like that. She thought of honey cakes stolen from a kitchen by two children who did not yet know what they would become. She did not forgive him, but she thought of him. And the thinking was its own kind of honesty. The marking ceremony, the public one, happened on a cold, clear morning at the Northern Territory's capital in a courtyard made of gray stone that was warmed by torches and crowded with wolves who had traveled from every corner of the continent to witness it. Not because they were commanded to, because they wanted to. The girl who burned the registry, Sarah, stood in the center of that courtyard in a dress that was dark green, the color of the Northern Territories, and her hair had grown to an inch dense and black, and her cheeks had filled enough that her eyes no longer looked oversized in her face, and the mark on her neck was visible above the collar of her dress, a crescent of raised skin that caught the morning light. Kale stood beside her. He was wearing black because he always wore black, and his scar caught the torchlight, and his golden eyes were fixed on her with an expression that 32 years of ruthlessness had not prepared him for. She looked at him. He looked at her. The courtyard was silent. 300 wolves quiet. She took his hand. His fingers laced through hers, and the tremor was there, always there, that impossible trembling that happened only when he touched her. The most powerful wolf alive, undone by the act of holding a hand. She did not say anything. Neither did he. She squeezed his fingers once, and the crowd erupted howls, filling the cold air, rising into the pale sky. And Serafina Voss, Alpha heir of the Western Reaches, Luna of the Northern Territories, the girl who burned the registry, stood in the noise and the light and breathed the sharp pine air and felt in the center of her chest her wolf press its nose against the warmth of its mate and sigh. The last image was this late evening, the courtyard empty, the torches guttering, Sarah sitting on the stone steps with her bare feet on the cold ground and a plate of bread and butter on her knee. Not because she was hungry, because she could, because the bread was there and it was hers and no one was going to take it away. And she could eat it or not eat it, and the choice was the point. Kale sat beside her, his shoulder touched hers. He reached over and tore a piece of bread from her plate without asking. She looked at him. He chewed, swallowed. Looked at her with those golden eyes, utterly unrepentant. She tore a piece off and ate it, and the butter was good, and the bread was warm, and the evening air smelled like pine and cedar and wood smoke from the hearth inside. And somewhere on the grounds a wolf howled one long note that hung in the air like a question. Another wolf answered it, then another. Sarah leaned her head against Kyle's shoulder and listened to the wolves singing to each other across the dark. And the bread was warm in her hands, and the stone was cold under her feet, and she thought of nothing at all, which was, after 9 years of thinking about survival, the most extraordinary luxury she had ever known.